It's estimated that around 20 million people lost their lives in World War I, while the number rose to about 80 million in World War II. To put this into perspective, these figures are equivalent to the current populations of Chile and Germany, respectively. But beyond the terrible human losses, let's analyze how the two world wars affect us today in terms of geography, society, politics, science, technology, and medicine. Let's start with countries and their borders. The world today looks very different from how it was in 1914. World War I led to the dissolution of four empires: the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, with the latter being one of the longest lasting in history, lasting 623 years. World War II, in turn, resulted in the dissolution of the Italian Empire, the Third Reich, and the Japanese Empire. Additionally, it initiated a global process of decolonization, during which countries like Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, France, the United Kingdom, and Portugal lost their last colonial possessions. The result? Today, there are 195 recognized countries, while before World War I, the number was around 60. It's highly probable that without the wars, these empires, or parts of them, or even new ones, would still exist today. For instance, the Portuguese Empire ended in 1999, and the British Empire in 1997. Therefore, without the wars, these and other empires could have easily extended their existence. Not to mention that today, countries like the United Kingdom, France, the United States, and the Netherlands still maintain overseas possessions. Now, let's move on to societies and politics. From the mid-19th century until 1914, around 60 million Europeans left their countries in search of better wages and resources, heading to places like the United States, Canada, Argentina, or Australia, among others. However, with World War I and later the Great Depression, globalization collapsed. Nationalist movements and economic isolationism took control instead. For example, the United States enacted a law in 1921 to restrict large waves of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. This significantly reduced the number of immigrants from those countries, affecting the social and economic dynamics of the time. Until the onset of World War I, most women performed domestic tasks, while only a small percentage worked, primarily in the textile industry and other sectors. However, during the war, there was a great need for labor, which led many women to enter the workforce in various sectors. After the war, many soldiers returned to their jobs, displacing the women who had temporarily taken on these roles. Nevertheless, due to the high number of deaths and injuries, some of these women managed to keep their jobs. In addition to entering the labor market, there was a significant second consequence: women's suffrage. In 1914, only in New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Denmark, Portugal, and Norway did women have the right to vote. In Australia, this right was limited to non-Indigenous women. In Denmark, it was restricted to local elections. And in Portugal, there were certain limitations. However, after the war, all of these countries granted women the right to vote. Although some imposed restrictions, this marked the beginning of the recognition of women's rights that most countries would follow in the subsequent decades. Now, let's talk about scientific and technological progress. Before World War I, airplanes communicated using Morse code. However, the war accelerated research, and in 1915, the first voice message was transmitted via radio from an airplane. 2 years later, the first ground-to-air radio transmitter was invented, allowing pilots to communicate with the control tower in the same way they do today. Another advancement in aviation was the creation of drones. Although previous experiments had been conducted, it was during World War I that the first unmanned aircraft was built. In 1918, the first successful pilotless flight took place, but the war ended shortly thereafter, so it cannot be tested in combat. Today, technologies advanced so much that drones are accessible and used in various applications. The ENIAC was the first digital, programmable electronic computer for general use. This computer was originally designed for military purposes during World War II, but it was not completed until 1945, after the war had ended. The US government made the ENIAC available to the public in early 1946. It occupied 140 square meters, had 40 cabinets that were 2 meters tall, and cost $400,000. In the 1970s, the patent for ENIAC's computing technology became public domain, lifting restrictions on modifying these designs. Continued development in the following decades made computers increasingly smaller, more powerful, and more affordable. Before World War II, aerosols were cumbersome to carry and use. However, the US funded research so that soldiers in the Pacific could use a spray against malaria-carrying insects. In 1943, what is considered the first modern aerosol was developed, which is now used in thousands of products. During World War I, submarines posed a significant threat. To detect them, underwater microphones were used, which required ships to make noise to be identified. Ultimately, the British developed a device that emitted ultrasound, solving the problem of ships being silent. This was the first technological application of ultrasound, a technology that is widely used in medicine today. Synthetic rubber, like that used in today's vehicle tires, was first synthesized in 1935, but it was not of the same quality as natural rubber. Despite improvements in 1940, this material was still not sufficiently developed. Almost all of the world's natural rubber production was in the hands of the Allies. However, after the Japanese invasion of parts of Asia, which took control of these rubber plantations, the United States launched a plan to improve synthetic rubber. By 1944, there were already 50 factories producing it, with a production volume that doubled that of natural rubber. Sanitary pads, or feminine hygiene products, were invented in 1888, but this invention did not gain much acceptance and fell into obscurity. However, during World War I, nurses observed that cellulose was much more effective at absorbing soldiers' blood than cloth bandages. This inspired a new cellulose company, Kotex, which was made from surplus wartime bandages and began selling in 1918. 3 years later, it was advertised and became a popular feminine hygiene product. Another area where humanities benefited from the world wars is in medical advancements. The Spanish flu was a pandemic that began during the war in the spring of 1918 and ended 2 years later. Originating in the United States, the group of American troops spread the flu throughout Europe. It's estimated that this virus killed between 20 and 50 million people, around 3% of the world's population. However, starting in the 1920s, many countries created or reorganized their health ministries, established better disease surveillance systems, and adopted the concept of socialized medicine. Additionally, in 1914, a doctor performed the first blood transfusion in a person. Until then, these transfusions were done directly from person to person. With the onset of the war, the rapid development of new transfusion techniques was encouraged, and most importantly, blood banks were established for the first time, something we still use today. The father of modern plastic surgery was a New Zealander who, while fighting in World War I, observed how a facial tumor was removed from a patient and covered with skin from the jaw. Enthusiastic about this technique, he convinced his superiors to open a military hospital where they would develop various plastic surgery techniques, operating on more than 5,000 soldiers. Many of these methods are still used today. A lesser-known fact about World War I was the development of chemotherapy for cancer treatment. The use of poisonous gases as chemical weapons, such as mustard gas, demonstrated that synthetic molecules could damage normal cells. Over time, molecules were produced that could kill more cancerous cells than normal ones, thus benefiting cancer patients. World War II brought additional advancements in chemotherapy due to the use of mustard gas and nitrogen mustard. World War II also represented a significant advancement in the use of antibiotics. Penicillin, discovered in 1928, was extremely difficult to produce. To give you an idea, the first patient treated with penicillin in 1941 died on the 5th day because there was not enough supply. However, World War II created great pressure to produce large quantities of this antibiotic, and after 3 years of intense research, mass production began in 1944. Finally, during World War I, the British had a concentration camp on the Isle of Man. One of the detainees studied yoga and began training his fellow inmates, refining his exercise methods over time. This man's last name was Pilates, and he was the inventor of the Pilates method. Furthermore, both World War I and World War II propelled the United States and the Soviet Union to become the two world superpowers in opposition during the Cold War, which left a significant impact on innovation, technology, and other areas. But that deserves a chapter of its own.